Welcome everyone, and delighted to have you all here today with us at the Dial Global virtual workshop. Hopefully all keeping safe and keeping well. If just by way of a little bit of housekeeping, if you've got your microphones off, just because of volumes and such, if you wouldn't mind popping those onto mute, and sending through any chat requests or questions that you may have, either via email, text, WhatsApp, or through the designated chat, which is just at the bottom of your screen here. I am delighted today to introduce Steve Kenzie. Steve is the Executive Director for the United Nations Global Compact Network in the UK. And Meenakshi and I and the team at Dial are particularly excited today to have Steve join us in what was originally going to be a live workshop, because we are such huge advocates of the wonderful work that the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals do. So Steve is very kindly going to be sharing with us some of the unique insights into the work that he's done, perhaps a little about his personal background, and also talk us through a number of the different facets that make up the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Steve himself, just a little bit about him, he's a very committed advocate for business in sustainable development, with a very broad knowledge of corporate social responsibility and human rights, environment, anti-corruption, and inclusive business knowledge. He's achieved a huge amount through a very, very varied career in both private sector and also civil society. He's formerly worked within the research sector. He's been program director and managing director for the Sustainability Hub as well, and he's Canadian, which is wonderful. So really great to have a mixture of individuals on the shows, on our content, on a lot of the virtual workshops. So I'm delighted to welcome you here today to be with us, Steve.
Thanks, Leila. Great, thanks, Leila. Thank everyone for joining today. As Leila said, I have a varied background, I suppose. So I'm very much a generalist, I think. I have a decent knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals, less so specifically on D&I. So I can sit, I think, comfortably within the nexus of those two themes, but certainly look forward to hearing from the experts as well as we get stuck in. To begin, I'd like to just briefly introduce UN Global Compact. As you see on screen, this is our 20th anniversary. The Global Compact launched in 2000 when Kofi Annan made an announcement. Well, it started in Davos, but basically the idea to combine business and the UN to introduce universal values that business that was more and more operating globally could extend into their global operations, to make globalization work for everyone. And the mechanism by which we did that was a set of universal principles. And these principles were drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And this forms a really robust foundation for this initiative. Any company that bases their corporate sustainability framework on these principles, or a supplier code on these principles, is in a very good position. Going into a challenging market, you can point to universal principles and expect that your suppliers and your offices in those countries are going to understand what we're talking about here and join you in wanting to build a business around them. So now the Global Compact started in 2000 with just 44 companies, and now we have over 10,000 companies and another 3,500 non-business participants. It's the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world. We are mobilizing a global movement to create the world we want, operating in just about every country. And there are local networks in 68 countries now, and that's the role that I have, is managing a local network here in the UK, where we have over 500 organizations that are participating in the Global Compact. We take the commitment that companies make very seriously, and we offer a range of activities to support them in fulfilling that commitment. Some of the logos that you're seeing on the screen, this is a mixture of things. We have very much a global local orientation in the Global Compact. Our head office is at the UN in New York. We will initiate programming here in the UK that addresses UK specific challenges. For example, when the Modern Slavery Act was introduced in the UK in 2015, that presented a new challenge for UK business that companies elsewhere in the world weren't yet needing to address. And so we delivered a range of programs to help our member companies cope with that. We're just launching now what we call a global impact initiative called Target Gender Equality. That's an initiative designed in New York with support from local networks around the world, but will be implemented at the local level in, I believe, over 20 countries. And that's going to be working with our members and experts to help implement the women's empowerment principles, as well as with the ultimate objective of the program this year is to increase representation of women on company boards and in senior management positions. There are other global impact initiatives, one on climate, driving for a 1.5 degree ambition from companies in alignment with the Paris Accord. The Young SDG Innovators, working with young executives to give them a breakthrough innovation mindset that will help them in their careers as well as the companies that they work for to bring in the kind of innovation that we're going to need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and fix climate change and our challenges around inequality as well.
Steve, I just had a couple of questions here which were around gender equality and also youth, so I thought it would be opportune to ask them now.
Sure.
Firstly, I wondered, and this is from a couple of members who are already members of the UN Compact membership, but new members wondering how they can get involved at their level within the organization, i.e. a lot of these are discussed at a higher level, but if you're wanting to get involved and you are kind of mid-level management or you are young, hungry, aspiring graduate, how might these, and these are actually women, the questions are from women executives, how might they be able to get involved? And the other question that I actually also had was specifically around giving back for future innovators. Now I can see you've got a lot of great pieces here on the screen around young SDG innovators, and I know that a lot of your initiatives are about very much that kind of that next generation of leaders and really giving them the supports, the tools, the frameworks, etc., to be able to get involved. I wonder whether you could explain in a little bit more depth for some of our members and listeners how the youth can get involved and some of those very specific initiatives. Are these pieces that businesses can plug into and it is almost like an academy for the youth within their organization, or can others outside of that get involved as well if the business is not already engaged with the SDGs, for example?
So the Young SDG Innovators program, we are currently recruiting for the next cohort. We're just wrapping up the first year. And the way it went this year, and I expect will go again, it's a company would join and would send 3 young executives below the age of 35 to be participants in the program. And the companies that participated this year, I have one that I'm thinking of. The 3 people that came from that company had never met each other before. They were from different divisions within the company, but they had a shared challenge. And there's a champion who is a more senior person within the company that just helps to ensure that whatever solution they develop through the program gets a hearing with the more senior management. So in the case of YSIP, it's only available to companies that are members of the network delivering it. So here in the UK network, but the YSIP program was run in 11 countries this year, and that's going to expand, I think, to over 20 countries next year. So a participating company needs to be a member of that network, and then they would have to sign up to participate in the Young SDG program. We've done a number of things around it. So we did make some of the programming available more widely to companies that were not directly in the program, and we're looking forward to doing some more with that going forward. It is an ongoing challenge, I suppose, that we have. Sometimes the dynamic of engaging effectively needs to be in a smaller group, but then of course we're a large group, and so we do need to find ways of disseminating the learning more widely, and that's something we continue to work with. Here
So
in the
just
UK,
in summary, sorry to interrupt there, Steve, but in summary, the example that you gave would be that you have 3 different organizations, and what it is, it's almost like a peer cohort for juniors within the organization. So firstly, they become a network member to the SDGs network, like we are at Dial, and then they would nominate an executive to 1 to 3 from anyone who is top talent under 35, and those individuals will join another 2 companies within the Sustainable Development Goals membership, essentially.
so
Is that right?
each company normally would send 3 people from their company to form a team that would work on a project for their company. And they would be in a cohort with between 10 and 12, 13 other companies that have each sent in a team. And they will work together on learning and bouncing ideas off one another, as well as within their own company team. And then there's a step out again into the global network. So there was a UK YSIP group of about 40 participants this year, but we have frequent contact with the project running in Denmark and in the USA and in the Netherlands, where our group were able to engage also across borders.
I see. That makes absolute sense. Now, thanks so much for clarifying. So it's in essence, if you had 10 to 12, you probably looked at about 4 companies that gave you 3 people. Those bright, young individuals under 35, they also get the opportunity to broaden out even further into the global network and complete a project. Fantastic. Okay.
And then we were thwarted by COVID-19, but there was meant to be, as part of our big 20th anniversary celebrations, there was going to be a leaders summit at the UN in the spring, and they were going to have an opportunity to showcase their solutions in that big global forum. Now that's had to be set aside, but we're looking at ways to give them greater exposure. So certainly the feedback from this year's group has been very positive. Now, Target Gender Equality takes a different approach. There, we're looking for 2 people from each company, and still hoping that there would be a champion. And then it's a different program of activity, but there will be gap analysis and capacity building, as well as networking and numerous learning opportunities focused in around gender equality and that board engagement. The other programs in development around an SDG action manager, the climate change program, still in development, but I would expect parallels there. Most of our activity here in the UK is at the practitioner level. So while it requires a CEO commitment to join the Global Compact, most of the activity that we're doing is working with sustainability directors and managers. We have a D&I working group where we get D&I and HR managers from different sectors coming together to exchange their views. But we tend to be much more at a hands-on problem-solving level with the activities that we organize.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, so to join, as I mentioned, it's a CEO commitment. So the CEO of your organization would need to send a letter to the UN Secretary General committing to 3 things: to operationalize our 10 principles through the business, to report annually on your progress towards doing that, and finally, to support the wider UN development agenda. That letter will be in the public domain, and we think it is a really nice reminder, should it ever be required, and at times like this, perhaps is when it's most valuable, of that commitment that the organization's leadership has made. So the wider UN development agenda at the moment, this is what it looks like. It's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's really what we're here to focus in on. So now I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the SDGs. Apologies if you're already quite familiar, and I'll try to make some linkages into the D&I agenda there, just to keep things rolling along. So the Sustainable Development Goals are the central part of Agenda 2030, which was agreed by all UN member states in September of 2015, after the largest consultation ever undertaken by the UN. Literally, tens of thousands of stakeholders contributed, really answering the question, what is the future you want? What do you want it to look like? And this is where we got to. 17 goals that sit above 169 more specific targets and 232 global indicators that will measure our progress towards achieving those goals. The goals apply to every country, and as I say, every country signed up and every country is still in. It's important to note that while it was governments that made the commitment, achieving the goals is going to require support from all members of society, and especially from the business community. And it's evident once you start to scratch the surface of this agenda, just how important that business role is in achieving the goals. It has been suggested when it first came out that, if you have 17 priorities, you don't have any priorities at all. And I think I wouldn't minimize how complex this agenda is, but equally, we are facing complex challenges. It is really, the ambition here is nothing less than transforming the world, economic systems, all our social systems, to deliver to people the future that they want. The goals are intended to be quite interconnected, so it's a very holistic agenda. There's no option for governments to cherry pick and just say, we're going to just take care of goal one. In reality, the way it's all configured, even if you tried to only fix goal one, as soon as you start addressing poverty, you'll also be addressing hunger and health and education and gender equality. The goals are so interconnected. And of course, the inverse is true. If we focus effort on addressing gender equality, that will have a positive impact on reducing poverty, improving health outcomes, even improving climate change and peace and strong institutions. So it's a very holistic agenda that is intended to leave no one behind. That said, if all you know about the SDGs is what you're looking at on your screen right now, you're really missing out on the richness of this agenda. It really is in the 169 targets where the real action is. And it's really important, if your organization wishes to engage with this agenda, and I would argue that really every business, every civil society organization, and every government needs to. This is more and more becoming the language certainly of development, but more and more certainly of corporate sustainability. And progressive companies are all aligning their corporate sustainability activities with this agenda. And it's becoming really more and more an expectation, as I said, of certainly of regulators and other stakeholders. So what I'd like to do now is just take a deeper dive into some of the goals to highlight how D&I starts to feature across the global agenda, and to flag up for you how these icons are fantastic. They're easy to remember, they're evocative, but they don't tell you the whole story. Goal 5 is gender equality. Um, the full text of the goal is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. I've just pulled out a few of the targets that sit within this goal. The first one, pretty much what you would expect, to end all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. So that's a bold ambition. And I didn't mention it earlier in the overview, but the goals came into effect on the 1st of January 2016 and are all meant to be achieved by the end of 2030. So we do have our work cut out for us. We've already used up a third of the time that was allocated, and the progress has not been as rapid as we need. So there's been talk prior to COVID-19 of this being a decade of delivery. And notwithstanding the difficulties we're facing now, that hasn't changed. It just means we're going to need to take advantage of the time now to learn and prepare so that when we do come out of lockdown, we can really move forward on this agenda. So 5.2, eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls. Yes, Leila.
Sorry, Steve, just a couple of questions that I think were opportune to ask here from members and also actually via LinkedIn. Is a number of people saying that they agree with the goals, they think they are fantastic, there are a lot of them, and a lot of businesses, especially even the global organizations, are focusing on a number of those and really pushing those forward. But the questions are how to actually really drive these and how they are tracked. You mentioned there briefly that the target for this should close at 2030 to be able to complete this. What does completion mean, and how can organizations track their progress? Is there a specific blueprint for this? And what are the main hooks that, if we're trying as employees within organizations to drive forward certain goals, which hooks can we use that will really help us push on our leaders, CEOs to sign up, or others to make sure that we are being instrumental in driving change?
I'm going to come to some of the measurement and the business engagement piece towards the end. I think that many of the business case for this, for D&I, for gender equality, is well established and predates the global goals. And so I think as far as that goes, hasn't changed. Having gender diversity on a board means the board will make better quality decisions. So regardless of anything the UN says, that's a clear business mandate, and the chair of any board has a fiduciary duty to bring about gender equality, because that will lead to better quality decisions. So where the SDGs come in, I think, is this is a flag in the sand. If a company wants to make a public commitment to goal 5, that's something that is going to be widely understood as a public commitment to gender equality, and the company is part of a global movement to create the future we want. So the role, I think, for the SDGs for many companies is that it will provide direction and a framework and a lightning rod to mobilize resources and partners from potentially other sectors or from within the company. In terms of it fundamentally changing the business case, it only does so insofar as it can raise awareness of the agenda and make it even more attractive to be doing this, because it just fits into this great global conversation that's happening. I didn't include any details on the actual indicators, just because that's usually more detail than people want to see in a presentation like this. But I will show some resources at the end where all of that is available. I would just qualify that most of the global indicators, and this is circling back to this, ultimately these commitments are from governments. So in most instances, the global indicators are not easily translated into business terms. Some are, but not always. So there's a fair bit of work being done, and there's much already out there that will help companies to think about how they want to measure their contribution in this area. Okay, so that's goal 5. That's the one, a very obvious D&I goal, but these aren't all the targets that sit within goal 5. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's evident how this goal will impact on the success of achieving just about all the rest. Without gender equality, it's going to be very difficult to eliminate poverty, to ensure good health outcomes and education for all, just as a starting point. Another goal that's highly relevant to the D&I agenda would be goal 10. Reducing inequality within and among countries. So this is a very broad agenda, and you see, again, I've only included 4 targets, and there are a number of others in this that are less directly relevant to business, because that idea within and among countries is meant to address obviously the big disparities between the global south and the global north. So it does bring in some of the big geopolitical challenges that we currently face, but equally within countries. And this is something that every company and every national government, even local governments, do need to start thinking about. So 10.1 is, again, looking at just the financial inequality and the lagging income growth of the lowest earning segments in the population, and calling upon governments to proactively change the way income's distributed in countries to bring about more equality. By 2030, empowering and promoting social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. So here again, that empowerment of minorities to give them a voice so that no one is left behind as we move forward. Ensuring equal opportunity and reduced inequalities of outcome. So here again, this is something that most countries and politicians will say they aspire to, but we haven't seen the action in that department that really we want to. And again, encouraging governments to adopt policies, fiscal, wage, social protection, etc., to progressively achieve greater equality. All of this goal is recognizing that to achieve the other goals, we need to have inequality. It's an objective in itself, but it's also integral to the whole agenda. The third one that I was going to look at a little more closely is possibly, there are a few of these goals that when you ask companies which goals are you prioritizing, that always come up. And certainly goal 8 is one that, not surprisingly, calling for economic growth, it appeals to business. That's typically aligned with what they were looking to do anyway. The full text of the goal is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So it does go beyond just what's in the icon. And I think that key point here is inclusive. Again, making sure that that economic growth does not just benefit a small segment of society, but is helping everyone. And the key way of bringing that about, of course, is through decent work, by ensuring that people are paid a living wage, that there are opportunities for young people, that we eliminate forced labor, and that labor rights are protected around the world. So I think I've covered the interconnectivity of the goals. So I think that's obviously really important. And we've seen just in these 3 how D&I issues are central. And so that really establishes, I think, a thread through the whole 17 of just how important the D&I agenda is to achieving this. Should I pause?
Yeah. Just a quick question here. And again, this is an amalgamation of a number of questions I've had around about trends that you've seen basically with organizations given COVID-19. And then I've had a number of people who are asking about mental health as well. So I mean, first of all, I'll just interject and just say I think it's excellent that you're relating the Sustainable Development Goals to diversity and inclusion and belonging, because for us as an organisation, as DAL Global, we look at diversity and inclusion in a far more holistic way than perhaps businesses were 10 years ago. When diversity and inclusion is discussed, often in boardrooms, the presumption is still that we're talking about race or that we're talking about gender. Actually, what we always say is we live in a 21st century modern society, and the future of workplace is more holistic. It's not just about those visible diversities, but it's also about those invisible diversities, the ones that sit below the skin level and the surface line, that encompass things like mental health, like social mobility. Businesses now are more so not waking up to the fact, but really starting to hone in on other aspects of trying to push upward social mobility, or bringing in talent from perhaps disadvantaged communities where they wouldn't necessarily have looked for before. And I wondered not only whether you might be able to, just because of the current situation and the questions that we've had, and perhaps speak in a little more depth before moving on about the good health and well-being, which I know is goal number 3, and something that we champion personally at DAL, because we think mental health inclusion on that side, very, very, very important. But whether you might also be able to mention number 16, which again, I'm sure it won't apply to everyone, but peace, justice, strong institutions. By what, for those that don't know, what encompasses institutions, because surely that is related in essence to some of the other goals. And finally, I love the fact that you're interconnecting all of these, because we picked out about 5 that we follow and we really try and push, because like you say, there's so many interconnected threads there, but do deserve to have their own individual goal almost. So thank you for that.
Goal 3 is definitely takes a well-being approach. So, it addresses the things you would expect. So the global crises around HIV and tuberculosis and malaria are all featured as objectives to eradicate these plagues before 2030. It also addresses non-communicable diseases like heart disease and things that are becoming a growing problem in the developing world. So that's addressed. It also addresses less expected things, such as substance abuse and death and injury from automobile accidents. So it is, again, quite comprehensive, and it definitely takes beyond health to well-being very much to heart. So it also addresses, yes, mental health, and urges governments around the world to ensure universal access to healthcare, including mental health care. So, and I think it is really interesting when you read through these targets. I'm sure, like me, you'll be amazed that it was possible to get every country in the world to sign up to this, because many of the provisions do seem to be out of sync with policies that we know exist in countries that are culturally in a different place.
Thanks, Steve. And one last question here from Neil Weavy, who is actually on the webinar live here today. He says, how do these economic inclusion drivers supporting LGBTQ plus populations in countries where access to employment is not protected?
Well, it's something that stakeholders seeking to shift government policy in those countries can point to, that the country has made this commitment. This is the sort of thing that typically presents, it's not an uncommon scenario for multinationals faced with a dilemma where they're trying to project universal values throughout their operations, and they're in countries that are actively legislating against that. And that is a dilemma. The SDGs are not binding. It's not law. These are commitments that that countries have made publicly. So in terms of, it's not going to force anything, but I think that it does lend a degree of moral standing. When a country has made a public commitment to this agenda, it does allow one, to point to it. And I think something that companies operating in such a country can point to as a way forward. But it's not an agenda for forcing. I don't think I've heard of any cases along the lines of what we've recently seen around climate, where stakeholders have sued a government for inaction. I'd love to see it, but that's not something that I've heard contemplated. I don't think the global goals have the standing of international treaty to be enforceable in the way that it would be very desirable.
Thanks for answering that, Steve.
Just a word on SDG 16. It's it's a bit of a catch-all. It is something that was very much led by the UK government to get that in. David Cameron, Prime Minister at the time, very conscious of a number of almost prerequisites for development. And those were peace, rule of law, and the absence of corruption. And so those are the key elements that are rolled into Goal 16, really to create the conditions in countries where investments in development would actually pay off. Business won't invest to create jobs and wealth if there's no rule of law or if there's just too much corruption. Peace is essential. Conflict just makes it too risky for investment. And of course, without investment, we don't get the jobs to lift people out of poverty, to bring about the change we're looking for. So really, that's what Goal 16 is expressing the need for those preconditions in order to achieve the rest of the agenda. Okay, why should business care? A few quick bullets on that. Firstly, we're talking nothing less than a transformation of society. This represents massive opportunity for businesses that are on the right side of that transformation. A study by the Business and Sustainable Development Commission that was produced just after the goals were adopted found US 12 trillion of new business value every year, just from a few sectors coming out of the transition that we're talking about here. The opportunities are massive as we transition away from high carbon energy and all the inequality that we've been speaking about. As we eliminate plastics, that plastics need to be replaced with something. For the entrepreneurs that are on the right side of that, there are fortunes to be made here. This is very much a pro-business agenda. It's good for business at a macro level. A better educated and more productive workforce is good for business. Economic and political stability, good for business. More fair and just societies, all good. Climate resilience, all good. This agenda is seeking to create the conditions in which business can thrive. At a micro level, businesses engaging in this agenda are more attractive to investors and to customers. It improves management of the supply chain, improves access to public procurement and public investment. Here in the UK, DFID have made it a requirement that all of their major grant recipients and suppliers be participating in the UN Global Compact. It's a proxy for being engaged on this agenda. Possibly the shortest line between this agenda and the bottom line is improved competitiveness in hiring the best human capital. It is evident, we're hearing it more and more, the best and the brightest are choosing to work for companies that have a purpose that they can identify with. More and more that is linked into the SDGs. It's evident that hiring the best and brightest now is going to translate into business success in the future. And of course, more and more, it's going to be a public opinion, reputational issue as well. Companies that can genuinely demonstrate that they are a good corporate citizen are going to do better in the eyes of the public. And I think, you know, the extraordinary situation we find ourselves in now, I think is going to make this even more acute going forward. A little bit like the what did you do in the war? Well, we'll see which companies are doing the right thing now, and I think can expect those that are doing the wrong thing to be punished when the time comes. Now, I've been speaking about this a little bit as if it's optional, and that you can choose to engage with this agenda. And the point of this slide is to sort of disabuse you of that just a little bit. So the Prime Minister in happier times, you'll see that on his lapel, he is wearing the SDG logo. If you were in any doubt about whether or not the government was aware of this agenda, be assured that they are aware. They are actively integrating the global goals into the single department plans, and it is part of policy. It is already influencing policy and will continue to do so in the future. Mark Carney, the headline, corporations told to draw up climate rules or have them imposed. He's referring specifically to the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But I think the idea here is, at the moment, it is, you know, voluntary with air quotes. It won't remain voluntary. If companies don't get out in front of this, they will be forced to act. The Uber headline, it's great, you know, job security for all of us working in this space. Stripped of their London license due to a lack of corporate responsibility. They clearly put the idea of the behavior of their drivers, of human rights, in a box with a big non-financial label on it, and just set it off to the side as if this wasn't important, until it was. And now it doesn't get much more financial than losing their London license to operate. So clearly, more and more, all of these issues, this comprehensive holistic agenda is integrated into financial and business well-being, and ignoring that is a big mistake. G4S, same problem. They ignored this, and their investors have hit them hard over it. In the bottom right corner, we've got Amazon workers going out on picketing. We just replaced that slide to be a little more timely. Up until today, that picture was Amazon workers protesting their company's lack of action on climate change. So it's not just external stakeholders that care about this, but more and more internal ones. But of course, the picture right in the middle of the crowd, that's Extinction Rebellion in London. And again, they're watching, they're ready to, shall we say, express their opinions about companies that are not engaging properly on climate change in the way they see fit. I didn't mention the picture right in the middle, but that's the cover of the UK's Voluntary National Review, which was a summary of the UK's progress to date on the Sustainable Development Goals that was presented at the UN last July. And that's in the public domain for you to look at your leisure. Okay, we're in the home straight, which is good, I see, as we're not a lot of time left. So just quickly, some of the things I mentioned earlier about what companies can do. On goal 5, Hikma Pharmaceuticals is a member of our network. They've brought this home. Their aim to empower women within the company and the broader community, and they've launched a committee within the company made up of females across the organization that are influencing and shaping company policy across the country, across the company, and it is a global company. On goal 10, This is a company called ERM, Environmental Resources Management, a really huge global consultancy. They've just recently updated their global policy with quite proactive guidelines for inclusive recruitment. The third one, SSE, Scottish and Southern Electricity, a big northern energy generator, working with an organization called Equal Approach to increase the proportion of talent, visible and non-visible, as you were saying, Leila, within their recruitment processes. I'm gonna just, go really fast through those so that we don't run out of time. So you're new to the SDGs. Here's a resource that I think is probably the best way to get started. The SDG Compass at sdgcompass.org. This was a collaboration between the UN Global Compact, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the Global Reporting Initiative. So 3 really big global organizations seeking to advance corporate sustainability. It's a simple change model that will help you engage on the goals. We've did a series of webinars on each step before Christmas. So here are links to all of those if you're interested in going a little bit deeper on them. But really simply understand the goals, understand your impacts, positive and negative. Once you've seen where you're having an impact, set your own goals for how you're going to make a contribution. Integrate those goals into the way you do business. This could mean everything. So SSE again, in the webinar, they talk about how they've integrated the goals, and they have linked executive pay to performance against SDG targets in their company. Doesn't get much more integrated than that. So that's just one example of how companies are driving this agenda in their work. And then finally, it's about reporting, because we need the leaders to lead and set an example for others to follow. And if you aren't talking about the good work you're doing, people can carry on thinking that they're doing okay because they don't know how far behind they've fallen. Okay, a couple of resources that Global Compact produced, again in partnership with the Global Reporting Initiative. An analysis of the goals and targets is a really valuable compendium of all of the metrics and indicators that are out there that business are using to measure SDG targets. So they're not necessarily labeled as such, but that's it. This report does that mapping exercise. So if you're looking at goal 5, here are some indicators you could use to map your contribution and measure your contribution to that. The second one is integrating the SDGs into corporate reporting. And again, a very practical guide to how, not just how to report, but how to engage on this agenda itself. We've got a couple of things coming up. We, every year for the last 4, have been doing a Global Goals Roadshow, and we've been visiting cities around the UK to talk about the goals. We're moving that online, at least for the spring. Hopefully we'll be going out in person again in the autumn. You can get some more information on that at our sdg-roadshow.org site. And something I think of particular interest to this audience, as part of the UN Global Compact's response to the COVID-19 crisis, the Global Compact Academy has been offering a series of webinars that are open to everyone. And next week's theme, next Tuesday, will be how business can support women in times of crisis. I think it's starting to get some attention, but probably not as much as it deserves. The entirely predictable increase in domestic violence that's been happening since the lockdowns have begun is clearly a problem. And I think we need to, as people are working from home, that does start to shift the responsibilities that employers have to make sure that their workers are safe wherever they are. So I don't know what range of topics will be covered in the webinar next week, but I'm sure that it will be very good. They've been getting, for the previous two that have been done, absolutely world-class speakers, and I think it will be excellent. So I urge you to join that. And now we had a question, but I'll leave it to you, Leila, whether you want to pose that or others, and where you want to go from here with our last bit of time.
Absolutely. We've had another couple of questions actually come through, Steve, around BAME, or Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, for anyone who may be here that doesn't know what that acronym already stands for. But there were a few questions around any key steps that there may be that you're supporting organizations with when it comes to increasing representation on company boards, and also any of the specific initiatives, or whether you can provide any examples which will be in relation to increased numbers of ethnic diversity or ethnicity, because of course that forms a big part of equality and peace and justice. And there were again a few comments that we've had about the relatively well publicized Sir John Parker review, which measured a number of the larger organizations when it came to BAME specifically, and the results were the movement was only 0.6%, which I think was relatively disappointing across the board. And so where we can utilize the SDGs and any hooks that you might have that might help our members, anyone who's listening, and those that have asked questions, drive forward the initiatives around ethnicity, that would be wonderful.
For us, I'm going to say I think we're not particularly strong in that area at this time. I would say we very consciously created a diversity and inclusion working group in our network rather than a gender equality working group. And I think that aligns with what we saw in the detail around Goal 10, that we are seeking to address all forms of inequality. So acknowledging that the target gender equality is very specifically talking about advancing women on boards. Certainly as we implement it here in the UK, we'll be seeking to take a more D&I approach. Global Compact being global means the BAME agenda is a little bit less explicitly relevant in countries elsewhere in the world. And so we would speak in more general terms about diversity, and that would then need to be interpreted in a country context. But I certainly agree that it's something that needs more attention here in the UK. I'm pleased to say I think that we, in our own network, in our network secretariat, have taken a number of steps to ensure the diversity in our team and in our hiring practices. And we've sought to promote that behavior with our members with blind hiring and these types of steps. But I think that this is an area that we certainly intend to do more in the future. We are very much member driven. And so we certainly, if pushed, with demand from members, we respond promptly. In the absence of that push, we still respond. We recognize that it's, we want to be led by the members, but we're not going to wait for them necessarily to ask that we do the right thing. So I think already our D&I working group is addressing that issue, but we need to expand it more widely into our open programming, and that's something that we will be doing.
Thank you ever so much, Steve. And I know that we are coming towards the end of the time for today. So what I will do post the webinar is everything is going to be going up onto our website, dalglobal.org. Not only will we put an on-demand version of this this live workshop or webinar up, but we'll also promote this to our members for you as well, Steve, because we think the work that you're doing is fantastic. We'll share all of your contact details there as well. I think in terms of questions, if anyone else does have additional questions, please do send those to Meenakshi, myself, or of course directly to Steve, or pop those in an email to us, and we'll make sure that we get those across. There could be some more of those coming, Steve, because the vast majority of individuals do watch this post its launch, so we'll be watching it not live. So we'll make sure those get to you. But just before we go, I just wanted to summarize a couple of key pieces from the learnings today, which were very wide and varied. So thank you very much. I think just picking out some pieces there. First of all, I think it is very impressive that all countries have signed up to this, and excellent that we can see that this is a voluntary piece, albeit there is not necessarily a you know, an absolute requirement to have to do this, but the fact that people are wanting to do it is great, and you can see that there's a good snowball effect there. You mentioned, Steve, that CEOs are signing up, and I really do think that these initiatives are driven from the top. Statistics and metrics prove that they are more successful when they start at that board level, so that is good to hear, and if you could board into the C-suite, that would be excellent. And finally, I think, you know, what is also, you know, excellent that you mentioned there is actually this is a holistic piece of work. This is exactly how we see the world of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and business for good. It's the fact that you've got a lot of interweaving connections here between the various goals. If you don't know where to start and you haven't started already, please do look at number 5, economic environment, and number 3, health and well-being, because they're a great place to start. And those are some of the ones that we are championing, Steve, with our analysis, our campaign analysis of organisations in FTSE, the public and private sector, which we'd love to speak with you about as well. So thanks very much, and please, you know, please do all pay attention to these and try and drive this internally with the organisations, because not only is it fantastic for business, it is the right thing to do, and clearly the UN SDGs are helping organisations create places where businesses and then societies can thrive. So thank you very much there, Steve. And someone is just saying here, it's Campbell Fitch saying, very good webinar, raised the full awareness of the goals. And he says that they're flying the flag at hashtag Glasgow Caledonian University, because I believe they are one of the universities that has really championed and put at the forefront of their students' learning programs, the SDGs. So that's good to hear as well, hopefully for you, Steve.
Yes. Well, thanks very much. It was my pleasure. I'm glad that you found it interesting, and I'm certainly really happy to talk about this anytime. So I welcome any questions, and thanks very much for having us.
Thanks ever so much indeed, Steve. Thank you very much, everyone, and please do visit www.dalglobal.org. We are doing a 30-day free trial for everyone that wants to join our online digital all-access platform, and we have a COVID-19 hub as well, which this will be going on, so it will be open to everyone to be able to access. So please do share it with your teams, and we will look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time. Do make sure you stay safe in the meanwhile, and have a lovely Easter weekend.